Today, I have the pleasure of talking with Shiri Lev-Ari from Royal Holloway, University of London. Shiri, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. Could you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure, happy to be here. So like you said, I'm from Royal Holloway, University of London, specifically the Department of Psychology. I've done my PhD at the University of Chicago in the United States, and then just did a few postdocs in different places before coming here. In general, I'm a researcher of language. I guess as we're going to talk about, I have several different directions in how I study language.
You've written numerous papers and done numerous presentations which really interest me. One of them which stands out, I think from 2010, I believe, was a paper called "Why Don't We Believe Non-Native Speakers?" Can you tell us a bit about that?
Okay, so the research in that paper, the set of experiments there is really inspired by the idea that sometimes we find that when we find information harder to process, so that means harder to understand, we tend to trust it less. So even if we can fully understand it, if we need to put more effort into understanding it, we don't believe it as much. And I heard about this research at the time that I was working about interactions between native and non-native speakers. And we know that it is harder to understand non-native speakers. So even when we succeed at doing that, we need to put more effort into understanding them. So I was wondering, okay, if we need to put more effort into understanding non-native speakers, and we tend to believe information less if it's harder to process, is it the case that we're going to believe non-native speakers less? So in short, the study found that yes. Do you want me to go into details of how we tested that, or?
Yeah, so this is what interests me. So your study actually found that as native speakers of a language, we believe information less when it's given to us in a foreign accent. That's essentially what you actually found, which is an incredible finding. So yeah, how did you establish that? How did you find out?
Yeah, so we basically, we told participants that what we're interested in is actually in seeing how good they are at estimating whether different facts that are little known are true or not. And we actually showed them both true facts and false facts. So they really just different trivia information about like animals, nature, and things like that. And basically what we manipulated is that we have multiple different speakers. A third of them were native speaker. A third of them had mild foreign accents, and a third of them had heavier accents. But every person just heard multiple statements from multiple people, such that, you know, every different fact, different people heard it from different people. And all participants needed to do is to say whether or not they believe the information to be true. So they needed to rate how likely is the information to be true. And basically, we found that the same fact, people believed it more if it was said with a native accent compared to either a mild or a heavy accent.
So it wasn't even the strength of the accent that matters. So we're not talking about people, if I put it really crudely, that have got such terrible English, it's almost impossible to understand. And that's why I don't believe it. It's actually people who I'm assuming are fluent, are articulating the words well, but have some form of accent to varying strengths. And even with, as you put it, a mild accent, native speakers found that less believable.
Yeah, so initially we did expect to find a difference between mild and heavy accent, but we did not find any, at least not in the first study. In a second, I'm going to put a caveat on that. I would say though, so yes, there were no grammatical differences or differences in vocabulary. Everyone read precisely the same statement. Regarding whether they pronounced them correctly or not, well, the accented speech sometimes mispronounces the word, but we did make sure that participants understood the sentences. So if they didn't understand the sentence, they didn't respond to the statement at all. So it's not about not understanding it, it's just about the fact that it feels a bit harder to understand. So yeah, the caveat I wanted to say is that in a later study, we tried to see, can we get people to stop relying on the difficulty of processing when deciding whether something is true or not. So we thought maybe if you make them aware of the fact. So I should explain that there's research that actually shows that if you make people aware of what's the source of the difficulty, why they find something harder to process, sometimes they don't infer from the difficulty about other things. So if you say, oh, this is only difficult because I just made this a little harder for you, then you no longer think, oh, then it's harder to process, therefore probably I don't believe it. So we thought it would just make participants aware. We really ask them to rate the accent. That's going to make them aware. We'll no longer see an effect. So this actually helped with mild accent. So it seems participants did make some correction and understood that some of the difficulty is really not about trustworthiness, but just about the fact that they're non-native speakers, but they still believed less the heavily accented speakers. So people didn't correct enough.
So even with, as it were, some form of preparation, if you like, or you're almost changing their expectations before the task, there's still a tendency not to believe as readily when there is an accent.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I would necessarily, I didn't see it as preparation. So we thought about the fact that sometimes, like if we think about other types of bias, ones that are based on prejudice, there are people that try to say, if we make everyone aware, can we get rid of the biases? And there's actually very mixed evidence to what degree that really works and whether awareness can really get rid of it. But we thought, first of all, let's, in a sense, see the same way, whether awareness can combat this. And especially because the literature that shows, okay, maybe I'll give it an example, not from language. If you call people on either sunny or really like cloudy and miserable days and ask them how satisfied they are in their lives, people actually report higher satisfaction when it's sunny, even though, of course, the fact that something like it's sunny or, cloudy and raining doesn't actually change how good your life is. But if you call them and you first ask, what's the weather like? And then ask how satisfied you are with your life, actually the weather no longer influences the responses as much. So in a sense, they kind of realize, okay, I only feel bad today because it's really crummy outside. That doesn't mean that my life is really bad. And then they actually provide better responses. So we thought it's the same way. We make people understand, yes, it's harder for you to process, but it's harder for you to process because these are non-native speakers. It doesn't, so don't infer from the difficulty that this is less trustworthy. But like I said, this only helped with mild accent, did not help with heavy accent. So it seems like awareness is good, but only as the very first step and not enough.
So two things come to mind from this. One is that this research has potentially really big implications in society, in many settings. If we're less likely to believe things said in a foreign accent, does that not negatively impact on, obviously, communication, but perhaps job prospects, academic progression at various levels, the ability to close sales in business? I don't know, even the credibility of people on trial in a court of law. Would that be a reasonable assumption that it could be the impact of this?
I definitely think so. And so I do think that it has implications for all the different cases that you said. I should say the effects are not huge. So it's not like people don't believe anything that non-native speakers and believe everything that's native, but it is another factor. And since in all the situations, there might be some ambiguity. Should I trust them? Should I not trust them? To what degree? Then yes, this might actually influence what decision you make at the end. And I would go even further. So I looked specifically at to what degree we believe non-native speakers, but we know that actually there are many inferences that people make from difficulty of processing, and they're usually negative. So if something is harder to process, for example, you also like it less, you also think it's more dangerous. So in that sense, we can also think that if you I don't know, interact with the non-native speakers, you might like the person less because of their accent, or you might think that if you talk about business investment, maybe you'll perceive the pitch they're giving you as riskier. So in a sense, it could be actually even more implications than just in terms of trustworthiness.
Yes. I was thinking about situations where, let's say, a native speaker is already under some pressure or feeling discomfort, which may impact on their processing abilities. I was thinking back to starting off at university in Freshers Week. I've left home, I'm still in the UK. I'm actually a bit homesick. I'm putting on a show of bravado to pretend that I'm feeling great and I'm really pleased to be here, whereas actually I'm really nervous. I'm trying to make friends, I'm trying to impress people. That, I suggest, is a situation where processing accented speech is going to be harder. For me, I'm thinking back now to when I was 18, and possibly in that sense, I'm wondering, would it be more difficult for me to believe what international students are saying to me? Would I naturally be able to integrate as easily with them as I would with people I can understand or people I can process their speech more easily? That's a very long question. Not even sure I got to ask you a question, but does that make sense? I'm just trying to think around the subject here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any research about that, but in general, definitely this can interact with other factors. So there are times, there are situations when we have more resources to process something compared to other ones. Maybe I'm under time pressure, maybe I'm just stressed, maybe I'm just multitasking. All these things can influence to what degree I find it easy or hard to process information in general. It could be that when I'm already stretched, making the effort to listen to non-native speaker is going to have even a bigger impact and going to influence what my impression of the person and of interaction even more.
Yeah, it's very interesting that the language you use, you talk about processing power and resources and bias and credibility. You're not really talking about xenophobia, racism, outright prejudice when you discuss this subject. Is it not the case that actually people didn't believe these accents because they're just xenophobic or prejudiced? I mean, can you account for that?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And I should say, I'm specifically interested in biases that are not prejudicial. So that is biases that do not stem from really already having a prejudice against non-native speakers, but even how any person, just because of the way we process language, is going to have this bias. This does not mean that there's no prejudicial biases against non-native speakers. There's plenty of literature that shows that it exists. We know it can influence hiring decision and promotion decision and buying in from different non-native speakers and impressions of them. We know that exists. I'm interested in the fact that even if we don't have that, we still show biases. And in terms of how do I know that, in my different studies, I try to look at it in different ways. The first study, what I tried to do is basically make it clear to participants that the speakers are just messengers. So we're not asking you whether you believe the non-native speakers, they're only delivering a message that the experimenter wrote to them. So the way we did that is we basically told all participants that basically all participants come, record sentences, and then their sentences will be played to other participants. So each and every one of our participants actually started a session by reading a list of trivia statements without knowing whether they're true or not. And we told them, and we actually recorded them, and we told them these recordings will be played to other participants later on. So they understood that they have no control over what they were saying. So when they're listening to native and non-native speakers, it's not about whether you believe or think that native or non-native speakers are truthful in general, because all statements are written by the experimenter. So that was the way we tried to get rid of it in the first set of studies. I would say later on, we did another study when we tried to really see whether we can reduce prejudice. So in that case, we didn't do this manipulation, but what we did do is we randomly assign people to a condition where we can make processing easier versus not. And we tried to see, can we find differences? And we did find that those who went through manipulation that made understanding the accent a bit easier showed smaller biases. So since that was completely independent from people's own opinion, it cannot be really explained by prejudice.
Interesting, thank you. And you touched upon this in at the end of your last answer, but we live in a world now where I think 75% of English speakers are non-native speakers or speak English as a second language. So native speakers like myself are very much in the minority, and we need to communicate successfully. And that includes being able to believe things that are true when they're said by a non-native speaker. So if you've got somebody, a native speaker like myself, who is about to go and interact with groups of non-native speakers, maybe at a university or maybe in business, what should a native speaker do to prepare for that in this context?
Yeah, so there's no real full cure for that in a sense, but there are ways that you can minimize the bias. And one way is that we know that exposure to accent makes it easier to process the accent. So, and you don't just need to be, so first of all, I have an accent, and I'm assuming that everyone who listens to the podcast found it potentially a bit harder to understand me, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes ago compared to now. And if they listen to enough people with the same accent like mine, maybe they'll find it also easier to understand new speakers with the same accent. And if people listen to enough different accents, then they'll find it easier to understand related accents. So to a degree, I mean, a lot of exposure to Spanish accent will not help you with Korean accent, but Spanish accent can help you with Italian accent and similar ones. So it can generalize to similar ones. So one easy solution is really just make sure that, especially people who need to interact with non-native speakers frequently, make sure that they receive, in a sense, some regular exposure to accents. And that way, when they interact with other non-native speakers, even if ones that they never met beforehand, they'll find the speech a little easier to understand. It's never going to completely get rid of the difficulty, and therefore it's not going to completely get rid of the bias, but you can reduce it by quite a bit.
So it's becoming more familiar with foreign accents by listening to them a lot. And what's the best way? Is it enough to listen to, let's say, one Spanish speaker speaking English, or is there an advantage to listening to several different speakers of another language speaking English?
There is an advantage to listening to more works, so to more speakers. So there's work by and Brandlow that really shows that, for example, that people listen to one Chinese accented speaker or several Chinese accented speakers, but for the same amount of time, and they were tested in how well they understood a new one. And if you're exposed to several one, you better, like, so even listening to one can help, but listening to several can help even more. So yeah, like I said, multiple speakers is better. And again, multiple accents can help with similar accents. So again, like exposure, the more varied it is, the better.
And you talk about, or you write about in your work on language and social networks, that the large, well, you'll have to correct me because I'm going to make the wrong correlation, I think, or an unproven correlation, but it seems that the larger our social network, the better we are at a language. Is that a reasonable summary of part of your research?
Yes, so that work is not specifically about native and non-native speakers, although I guess it can be true for that case as well. So the idea is similar to what I talked about now, that variability, exposure to more, having more diverse exposure can help with understanding accents. That's true about language in general. So people who have larger social networks, meaning people who regularly interact with more people, actually better at understanding the speech of new people that they never met compared to people who don't. Now, of course, we can all, if we are able to understand novel speaker we never met, but we do find an advantage, and especially if you have difficult listening conditions. So for example, in our experiments, to make it not trivial, they just listen to the speech with some background noise, which is something that happens. You often talk to people in public transport, or maybe there's a construction site next to you, or just, different types of noises. And we show that if you have a larger social network, you're better at understanding the speech of just other native speakers like you.
And that's a similar thing then to being exposed to a range of speech. If you have a larger social network, you're exposed to the speech of more people, to put it very simply.
Precisely. So the idea is that no two people speak precisely the same way. So even if you look at native speakers who are native speakers of the same language with the same dialect, each person pronounces each word slightly differently. So if you're exposed to very few people, in a sense, you don't understand the entire variability that there is in the language. But the more people you're exposed to, the more you understand how the speech can vary, and that makes you more prepared to dealing with new people.
And the background noise thing is really interesting. A part of the work that we do at Say What and Say Again is within aviation, where we're training people, native and non-native speakers, to communicate effectively for safety. And one of the big problems you have generally with aviation is that because you're on an aircraft and the air traffic controller's on the ground, you're speaking over the radio, and there is a lot of background noise with the engines, for example. So it's interesting what you're saying, that the more exposure you have to a variety of speech with background noise, the easier that becomes, and therefore I presume communication could be safer ultimately in that context.
Yes, and I would say that the more you're exposed to a variety of speech, not just speech, just a variety of speech, so you regularly interact with more people, the better you'll be at all listening conditions, whether they're clear or harder.
Yeah. I was at a conference on internationalization at home earlier on this week, looking at ways in which universities in the UK can enhance the curriculum and the hidden curriculum by providing more international opportunities for UK students at universities. And it seems to me from what you're saying that this kind of integration and exposure to different accents, different types of speech, i.e. different speakers, could be a real important part of that. I think I'm thinking aloud, but as a life skill, being able to communicate internationally in English is more and more important for native speakers who are in the minority. So would you encourage home students to try and interact as much as they can with international students?
Yes, I mean, I think interactions between with the international students or in general between native and non-native speakers is always, it has multiple benefits. So one of them is, like I said, interacting with more people makes you better at understanding the speech of someone new. In addition to that, like I said, my research is not about prejudice, but if we look about research on prejudice, there's also research that says that contact can also help, especially if the interaction is actually positive and people have similar goals in the interaction. So in that case, actually interactions with multiple speakers can help with everything. It can reduce biases of all types. So yeah, I think that's definitely recommended.
We've been talking about listening, accents, and sounds in English. Um, why is it that saying "shut the fuck up" sounds harsher than saying "shh"?
So I'm assuming you're referring to my research on swear words. I would actually say that I don't know that, I mean, shut the fuck up sounds harsher than shit. I don't think this is about the sound, because I did look at the sounds, but the sounds that I found that are relevant actually don't appear in either of them. So in general, there's a phenomenon that is called sound symbolism, and that is when words sort of sound like what they mean. So for example, in many languages, the word for nose has the sound n, and it could be because, well, n is a nasal sound, so it's a sound we produce with the nose. So it makes sense that in many languages that happen to be part of the word nose. Similarly, people tend to think that the sound E sounds very small, or at least much smaller than sound like ah or oo. So the idea is that we have some association between sounds and meaning. And in research that I've done with Professor Ryan McKay, also from Royal Holloway University of London, we actually looked at swear words. So we tried to see whether we can find some, whether swear words are basically sound symbolic and whether they tend to have certain sounds compared to others in order to express basically the harsh feelings that you have. So we did it in different ways. If you want to, I'll be happy to explain how, but in general, our conclusion was not that certain sounds are particularly common in swear words, like we initially thought we'll find. We actually found that in general, swear words really don't have or avoid certain sounds that are really not harsh. So specifically, sounds that are called approximants. These are sounds like l, v, y, and r. So they are really avoided in swear words, potentially because they sound too soft and not harsh.
And so you've also found, I think, that you can moderate swear words by introducing the very sounds that they tend not to contain.
So we found that English already does that. So we did it ourselves, but what we really look at those. So we looked at cases where, for example, instead of saying fucking, you say frigging. Or so those, I'm forgetting now the word that describes these type of softer swear words. But basically what we found is that if you look in English and compare basically the original swear word to its softer version that is considered much less.
Minced oath was the term
Yes.
you used. Yeah,
So
yeah.
we looked at minced oath. So I would say minced oaths don't exist so much in other languages, or they're quite rare, but in English they're actually very common. So it's really easy to find a softer version of a swear word. And yeah, like in the example, for example, between fucking and frigging, you can see that actually what happens is you add the softer sound "r" in this case, and suddenly the word sounds much less harsh, and you can say it even in cases where you wouldn't use the original swear word.
Yes. I read recently your work on non-native speakers and judicial penalties, which I found really interesting. And as I was going through, it seemed in some cases to well, build upon, even contradict previous thoughts about leniency. Can you tell us a bit about that research that you've done, please?
Yeah, so that work, as you said, was also the master thesis of Marie Christine Rule, who was a master student in forensic psychology. That I was her supervisor, so we worked on it together. So basically, what we try to look at relates to work that already shows that people are less emotional in their second language compared to the first language. So there's a lot of evidence that shows that, whether it's things that shows that whether you just people rate words as less emotional in the second language, or even physiological reactions to taboo words or sad words, or really don't lead to the same reaction in native and non-native speech. So we looked at how that relates to judicial decision, because the idea is that if you need to decide as a jury member or as a judge what kind of penalty to give to someone, supposedly, so prior research already started looking at that and said, okay, you usually feel, because you have a greater emotional reaction in your first language than the second language, you're going to give harsher sentences in your first language versus the second language. And there is research that finds that. What we looked at it is from a different direction. So we looked at what happens if we're looking at whether the actions of the perpetrator were really driven by emotion or not. So to give you an example, we had two very similar crimes. In both cases, the perpetrator committed fraud for the same amount of money from the place of work, so for the same duration. And so really the same crime, only his motivation for the crime was different. In one of them, which we called the emotional one, the case was that his wife was very sick. The insurance wouldn't cover experimental treatment. They would have no way of covering the experimental treatment, and like with the budget that they have. And the idea is that he only committed fraud in order to be able to pay for the treatment. All the money from the fraud was only used for that, nothing else. So you can see it was driven by very extreme emotional situation. In the other case, like I said, precisely the same type of crime, same fraud, same amount, same duration from the same company. But this time, he just committed it because, well, he wanted more money and he used it to just buy cars and, real estate and things like that. And what we looked at is whether participants would react differently to these different reasonings in their two languages. So in general, in many countries, there is the idea of extenuating circumstances. And if there are extenuating circumstances, you're not going to give as harsh of a penalty compared to the other case. So you should find that people basically recommend a more lenient sentence to the one who committed fraud because of his wife's sickness compared to the one who just committed it out of, well, wanting to be rich. But if you don't really react emotionally to the same degree, maybe you will not differentiate these two crimes as much. So that's what we found. We had native and we had non-native speakers basically listening to the perpetrator, just describing what they did and why. So basically to the confession. And we find that everyone showed a difference, but a difference, so basically how much you basically consider the extenuating circumstances, it was larger if you do it in your native language compared to your non-native language.
And so that in itself, that last point, presumably controls for culture or culture differences.
To a degree. So it wasn't, we were limited in what we were able to do because we wanted to, you need to control one side or the other one. So ideally, people should continue doing the. So what we did is we had the native speakers were Americans and the non-native speakers were mostly German. So in that way, you can say that that's an issue. We had different ways of making sure that that's the case, that it's not about cultural differences. Some of them think that they're ranking the different scenarios in the same way, or the fact that we're looking that they're not just not responding and responding in the, like, giving like middle of the road responses. We had different checks, but I would agree further research is required to really make sure that if you do the same thing, so ideally, if someone wants to do the study, for example, in Germany and doing with native German speakers or non-native speakers of German, that would be ideal if we can replicate it. But yeah, we had limited options. So practical reasons, we did it this way.
Shiri, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Thank you very much indeed.
Happy to be here. Thank you.